Hey guys, I want to take a minute here to talk about dynamic EQ, why it's different to normal EQ, and how it's actually useful when we're mixing or indeed when we're mastering. So I want to show you two examples here, one of why it's useful in a mixing context, and then also why it's useful in a mastering context when we're thinking about what the next stage in the process is. So first of all, I've got this dynamic EQ on a kind of a drum loop, and we're just going to see why it's useful, what it is that it actually does that differs from normal EQ. Now, dynamic EQ is like a normal EQ except for the word if. So it's going to EQ something if something is true. So for example, if we have a normal EQ and we boost the low top end, then it's going to boost the low top end to absolutely everything. In the case of a dynamic EQ, it's going to boost the top end if it meets a certain set of criteria. So this is determinable by a threshold. On a dynamic EQ, we will set a threshold and we will say that anything that goes above that threshold will either get EQ'd up or we can EQ it down as well. Let's take a look at an example. So here I've got the Ozone EQ from iZotope, and we've got our bands here as we would expect them, 1, 3, 4 and 6, but we've got arrows above and below them, and this means that we can EQ up or EQ down based on a threshold. So if we take a look at band 3, for example, we've got our normal EQ controls, but then we have this over the side here as well, and this is our threshold. So if I bring this band down, for example, and just press play, you can see this little trace moving here. And we can make that more or less impactful by bringing the threshold down. And this meter here is essentially the audio coming in, and we're trying to make it meet the threshold at the point we want it to. So dynamic EQ is going to EQ a signal if it reaches the threshold, if it reaches the point at which we're saying EQ at this point. We can EQ down or we can EQ up as well by just ticking the up arrow. Now, this may not be too audible at the moment because dynamic EQ by very design is meant to kind of solve a problem. It's meant to get something out the way when it's needed. We're not just adding a load of mid-range or a load of top end. It's just kind of carving away at the sound. And this is going to be really apparent when we listen to this kind of high-pitched pluck that we've got here. So just take a listen. Got like a ring there, almost like a triangle kind of sound, and we can zone in on whatever frequency that is kind of occupying and just EQ that out. But importantly here, we're not going to be EQing the entire signal, we're only EQing the track when that small ring is present. So in Ozone, I can just sweep a band around, and if I hold Alt, then I can just solo in on that band. So let's do that and just try and hear just that one ring. We can see it here as well. Let's bring that down. Okay. Threshold down. Let's make this tighter. All the way. So before, really obtrusive. Now, we're really just deadening it. We're not taking it away entirely because there's going to be harmonics there. There's going to be a lot more to the signal than just that one specific frequency. It's not a sine wave. But dynamic EQ is really to solve a problem. Dynamic EQ is there so that we can EQ and really just sandpaper the signal off. We can really just kind of mold things and just bring things down or up a touch whenever we need them to. We don't want to be EQing the entire signal. We're only doing it if it becomes a problem and if it passes the threshold. So let's have a look at doing something different. Let's go for this snare and let's EQ something up when it meets the threshold. So let's try and find the snare. It's in that range somewhere, isn't it? Let's try it there instead. So we can make it so that we're EQing up, but only when the snare meets that threshold. So let's just play it again and try and adjust the threshold to kind of meet that snare. can see this is kind of moving in time with when that snare hits. And in the Ozone EQ, something that you don't always get with every dynamic EQ is you've got an attack and release as well. So if we take a look at this arrow on the right hand side, when we've got some attack and release characteristics, we can make it so it's EQing for a very short amount of time. You'll see this trace come straight back down again after the snare hits. Or we can make it so it's kind of releasing for a very long time, staying up there for much longer. And when you look at that in terms of, let's turn that one off, in terms of this band that we've got over here. So I've actually put these attack and release times on absolute 0, just so that we're really getting rid of it straight away. If we were to bring this all the way down again and then just go to our attack and bring that up slightly, we're going to hear a little bit more of that frequency come through in the initial kind of hit of it. As I bring that down, we're going to start to deaden it. So it's a way of just manipulating things just a little bit more. As I said, dynamic EQ is not like a really aggressive process, or at least in my mind, it shouldn't be. It's about just shaping something before it maybe gets to the next stage. This is where it's kind of important in mastering, and you'll see that in Ozone's Master Assistant, it actually includes dynamic EQ, and for a very good reason. So I've just got a track in here which we're going to use Ozone's Master Assistant on. If we go to Ozone 10 and then just go to the familiar Master Assistant, we're just going to run this for a moment and you'll see how it uses dynamic EQ. Okay, so I'm just going to turn all these other modules off because this track, I believe, is actually already mastered, so it might be a bit weird mastering a master. You can see that it's got these 4 bands that have been enabled here, and this is just using the kind of intelligent way of thinking. You'll see that dynamic EQ is placed before the maximizer, so before the limiter. What this is going to do is it's going to try and make it so the limiter isn't working too hard. So dynamic EQ, as we said, is going to EQ something if. It's going to EQ something if that frequency range is too prominent, if it's too much of an issue. And you'll see as I press play that it's going to dip out some of these frequencies just at specific times. And then we'll zone in on those frequencies and just hear exactly what it is that it's doing. So you can see this one is almost certainly the kick. Oh, it's actually the snare. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. So what that's really saying to us is that the snare in that kind of frequency area, that, what is it, 220 hertz, is a bit too prominent, and it's probably going to be triggering the limiter a bit too much if it were not in place. And these other bands are going to be focusing in on similar things. The high end, I would assume, is going to be kind of a sibilant thing, but the important thing here is that it's preparing it for the next stage. It's preparing it for the limiter so that the limiter is not having to work too hard. Now, this is not a particularly bass heavy track, but if it were, then we would have the dynamic EQ working quite a lot in that bottom end to bring it down for the next stage, so the limiter is not indeed bringing this signal down too much. And dynamic EQ is a really useful tool for that kind of thing, for just shaving off little bits of frequency information on certain instruments. Sometimes it can be quite a useful thing if you're working on like a full mix and you just want to bring down a snare on a master. Then you can just notch out the snare just a touch without having to be too intrusive to the rest of the signal. Because you can see if you have a snare that's at like 220 hertz like it was there, and you're trying to use a normal EQ, then although you're trying to dip out the snare, you're also going to be dipping out the guitars, the bass, anything else that's in there. If you just set the threshold so that it listens to just that one snare, the level at which that snare becomes a problem, then you can just dip out that snare and you're going to get a much more natural sounding master. So a couple of examples there which I hope have been useful. If you just want to really accentuate a certain area, say an example here on the snare, then you can bring up a dynamic EQ band so that when it reaches that threshold, if it reaches that threshold, it will come up. Or if you want to attenuate something, if you want to bring down a certain frequency area, if it reaches the threshold, then you can use dynamic EQ to dip a frequency out as well. So it's very similar to normal EQ, except it's only being effective if it's reaching the threshold. So it's kind of going towards that more compressor mentality of things. It's not multi-band compression. That's a story for another day. I hope it's been useful. I'll see you again soon. Take care.